When your soul collapses, something terrifying happens. Everything goes silent. But that silence isn't emptiness. It's a message. And if you ignore it, you risk losing the one thing you can't replace: yourself. Most people believe collapse is the end, but that belief is exactly what keeps them trapped in the same cycles of pain. What they don't realize is that when life finally breaks them, it's not destruction. It's the first real invitation to transformation. That heavy, echoing silence that appears when everything falls apart, it holds truths they've been running from for years. There's a specific kind of emptiness that shows up only when the soul can no longer carry the weight of old identities, broken expectations, and stories that were never theirs to begin with. And even though it feels terrifying at first, this silence is the doorway to rebirth. Inside it lies the awakening, not the beautiful, poetic kind, but the raw, uncomfortable truth that finally sets a person free. Today, you're going to understand why collapse isn't your enemy, and why the silence that follows is the most powerful turning point of your entire life, because hidden inside that stillness is the blueprint for your essence, the revelation waiting to emerge, and the transformation you've been unknowingly preparing for. If you stay with me until the end, you'll see that what feels like losing everything is actually the moment you finally start becoming yourself again. There comes a moment in every person's life when everything they built suddenly begins to collapse, and they can't quite explain why. It's not just a crisis. It feels like the universe whispering a truth they've ignored for far too long. In that heavy quiet, when all the noise fades, a strange silence rises and forces them to face what truly matters. They start noticing the shadow they've been running from, the part of themselves asking to be seen. It's in that raw exposure that a deeper awakening begins to flicker. Pain becomes a kind of strange teacher, showing them revelation after revelation. And even if they resist, transformation is already happening beneath the surface. He often thinks back to times when life looked stable on the outside, yet something inside felt unbearably off. Only when things finally broke did he understand that collapse isn't punishment, it's guidance. It strips away illusions he thought were protecting him, but were actually limiting his essence. That moment of breaking makes him feel small, yes, but also strangely honest. It's the truth speaking in a voice he can no longer ignore. Silence, once a stranger, becomes the only space where he can hear himself clearly. And in that space, the seeds of rebirth quietly take root. Think of someone who stays in a job that drains them simply because it's predictable. One day, the weight becomes unbearable and everything crumbles. Performance drops, health declines, motivation disappears. At first, it feels like failing, but soon they notice how the collapse reveals what was invisible before. Their shadow dreams, the ones buried under survival mode. Maybe they always wanted to start a small business, switch careers, or create something meaningful. The pain becomes a compass, pointing them toward their truest essence. That's the revelation that only comes when the structure falls apart. He begins to realize that the moments he feared most were actually moments designed to set him free. When the truth finally emerges, it doesn't arrive as a gentle conversation. It comes as a sudden, sharp awakening. It shakes him from the inside, forcing him to see patterns he's repeated for years. Silence becomes the mirror, reflecting back everything he tried to hide. The collapse reveals the shadow, yes, but also the potential for rebirth woven into it. There is transformation hiding in plain sight, waiting for permission to begin. And that permission only appears in the stillness after everything falls. This is why he now understands that truth rarely speaks in comfort. It speaks through disruption. When life removes what no longer resonates, he feels exposed, but also strangely liberated. The collapse clarifies priorities he never questioned before. Pain opens doors that comfort keeps shut. Revelation settles in through silence like a quiet guest. rearranging everything he thought he knew. And although he doesn't fully grasp it yet, this moment is preparing him for the next stage of awakening. Something deeper is approaching, something that will connect directly to the essence he's just rediscovered, leading him naturally into the next realization waiting ahead. He begins to notice something subtle. Life never lets anything collapse without purpose. What feels like chaos is often the first quiet invitation to return to himself. When the old structure finally breaks, it exposes the truth he avoided because it felt uncomfortable or too heavy to confront. The silence left behind doesn't punish, it invites. It's an opening, a doorway he never would have seen if things stayed the same. This collapse softens the noise around him, letting the first signs of awakening rise from the inside. And for the first time, he senses that pain might be guiding him instead of defeating him. Every major transformation begins exactly at the moment he thinks everything is lost. He remembers a friend who went through a brutal burnout, believing it was the end of his career. But that collapse forced him to reconsider his entire path, eventually leading him to launch a small consulting business that aligned with his essence. It was the shadow of exhaustion that revealed the truth. Life was pushing him out of a place he no longer belonged. The pain illuminated possibilities he couldn't see before. And in the silence that followed, a quiet rebirth started shaping itself. Invitations rarely look like blessings at first. Life speaks in metaphors long before it speaks in words. A bridge doesn't crack just because. It cracks when the weight it carries no longer matches its design. The same happens within him. The inner collapse points to a revelation he needs in order to grow. Some people ignore the signs, trying to patch the cracks instead of asking why they appeared. But cracks are messengers. They show where the transformation must begin. And once he notices this, the collapse starts feeling less like a curse and more like a coded invitation written directly to his soul. He also realizes that invitations from life aren't always gentle. Sometimes they arrive disguised as lost relationships, rejected opportunities, or sudden endings. The moment something falls apart, a deep silence follows, one that feels almost sacred. Inside that stillness, he senses awakening whispering beneath the surface. The shadow of what hurt him begins to point toward what will heal him. Pain becomes a map instead of a wound. And although he isn't fully stepping through the doorway yet, he feels its presence widening, urging him toward the next truth he must face. When he finally understands that collapse is an invitation, everything shifts. He stops asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and starts asking, "What is this trying to reveal?" That single change opens a new path inside him. The essence he buried under obligations begins to reappear. Revelation unfolds slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night. Transformation starts taking shape without him forcing anything, and even though he doesn't realize it yet, this invitation will lead him directly into another layer of awakening, one that will confront illusions he still holds tightly. Pain has a strange way of peeling back everything that isn't real. When someone goes through a collapse, it exposes layers they didn't even know they were hiding behind. The pain becomes like a quiet sculptor, chiseling away the illusions they built to feel safe or accepted. It reveals the truth they refused to touch because it felt too raw. In the shadow of discomfort, awakening begins to form its first shape. What once seemed unbearable becomes the very force pushing them toward transformation. And in that silence after the storm, they start noticing what was always there beneath the surface. He thinks about times when he forced himself to pretend everything was fine, repeating the same routines, even though something inside him felt hollow. It wasn't until the pain grew louder than the illusion that he finally paid attention. Pain, when faced honestly, points directly to the essence he lost along the way. It highlights truth, like a spotlight in a dark room. The collapse may feel harsh, but it removes what no longer belongs. And as revelation slowly emerges, he realizes the discomfort was not a punishment. It was preparation for the rebirth ahead. Consider someone who stays in a relationship long after love has been replaced by silence. They convince themselves it's better than being alone, until the emotional collapse arrives, an argument, a betrayal, or simply the exhaustion of pretending. Pain shatters the illusion like glass. In that moment, they see the shadow of their unmet needs, the truth of what they've sacrificed. Awakening begins not in clarity, but in the ache that forces them to stop lying to themselves. And unexpectedly, transformation starts right there in the ruin of what they tried to preserve. Pain reveals what comfort hides. When life is easy, illusions grow quietly, like vines wrapping around someone's identity. But when collapse hits, the vines snap, and they finally see themselves clearly. Silence becomes the space where they sort through the debris of old beliefs. They begin recognizing which stories were inherited, which were imposed, and which were simply untrue. Pain isn't gentle, but it is honest. And this honesty prepares them for a deeper revelation that begins unfolding in ways they didn't expect. He starts understanding that pain is not the enemy, illusion is. When pain arrives, it strips away the masks he wore for years, masks of strength, certainty, or perfection. What remains is his essence, fragile but real. The collapse opens a door he never knew he needed. With each moment of discomfort, a small rebirth occurs inside him, almost imperceptible at first. This transformation pulls him toward the next truth waiting in his journey, a truth that will connect directly to the parts of himself he abandoned long ago. When collapse finally arrives, something unexpected steps out from the corners of the soul, the shadow. Jung believed this hidden part of us carries everything we refuse to acknowledge, yet desperately need in order to grow. In the silence that follows the breaking, this shadow becomes impossible to ignore. It appears not to punish, but to reveal the truth buried under years of pretending. Pain becomes its language, awakening its message. And although meeting the shadow can feel uncomfortable, it marks the beginning of an inner transformation that has been waiting patiently in the dark. He remembers moments when he felt triggered by others, jealousy, anger, resentment, only to realize later that these reactions weren't about them at all. They were reflections from his shadow, asking to be seen. Collapse makes these reflections clearer, removing the filters that once softened their impact. What once felt like random pain now becomes revelation. He sees pieces of his essence tucked inside traits he rejected in himself. Awakening grows slowly in this recognition. And each new truth prepares him for a deeper rebirth he didn't know he was capable of experiencing. Imagine someone who always avoids conflict, convincing themselves they're just keeping the peace. When their life collapses, perhaps through a failed relationship or burnout, they finally notice how their silence was actually self-betrayal. Their shadow steps forward, showing the truth. They weren't peaceful, they were afraid. It's a painful realization, but also a liberating one. The collapse forces them to confront the parts they minimized, and little by little, transformation emerges from the rubble of who they pretended to be. The shadow is not darkness, it is potential. Jung described it as the doorway to wholeness, and only through collapse does this doorway become fully visible. When he looks honestly at the parts he avoided, he discovers qualities he desperately needs: courage, desire, creativity, assertiveness. Pain brings these traits into focus, like a spotlight revealing forgotten treasures. In the silence that follows, rebirth begins to feel possible, and although the process is unsettling, he senses he is stepping into a version of himself that feels more authentic than anything he has lived before. As the shadow continues stepping forward, he starts realizing that collapse didn't break him, it exposed him. It removed the illusions blocking his awakening, pushing him toward a deeper truth. The pain that once felt unbearable now acts as a guide, pointing toward transformation. Every revelation becomes a piece of the puzzle, reconnecting him with his essence. And as he follows these pieces, he begins feeling something shifting inside, a subtle preparation for the next insight that will rise from the silence and lead him further into the path of becoming whole. There comes a quiet moment after the collapse when a person realizes they've been listening to everyone except themselves. It's subtle, like hearing a faint voice under layers of noise, and yet undeniable. This is the moment awakening finally becomes personal. The silence created by pain doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels like truth resurfacing. The shadow steps back just enough for their essence to breathe again. They begin to recognize desires they abandoned, values they compromised, dreams they muted. And this first whisper of self-recognition becomes the earliest sign of an inner rebirth preparing to unfold. He notices this shift most clearly in everyday situations. He might be sitting alone in his car or walking through a grocery store when a sudden clarity hits him. This isn't who I am anymore. It's not dramatic, it's honest. Collapse rearranges the inner landscape so profoundly that the old version of him feels foreign. Pain clears the internal static that once drowned out his truth. What remains is a revelation, a small, steady voice guiding him back to his essence. And although he doesn't fully trust it yet, he can feel transformation stirring beneath the surface. Think of someone who has spent years choosing what others want. The safe job, the acceptable partner, the practical dreams. When their life falls apart, the silence that follows reveals the cost of those choices. They finally hear the truth they avoided. They were living someone else's script. The awakening begins not through motivation, but through exhaustion. And in that exhaustion, a new kind of clarity rises, one that feels like a gentle confrontation with the self. This clarity becomes the spark that ignites their rebirth. Hearing yourself again is like remembering the sound of your own name after years of forgetting it. It feels familiar yet surprisingly new. The shadow that once dominated the narrative now softens, giving space for revelation. Pain becomes less of an enemy and more of a translator, explaining what went wrong and why. Silence becomes a sanctuary, a place where transformation gathers strength, and with each small moment of recognition, he feels himself stepping toward a deeper truth, one that he can no longer ignore. This renewed inner voice doesn't shout, it nudges. It encourages him to question routines, relationships, and environments that no longer align with his essence. It whispers alternatives, new paths, new possibilities, new identities. This is where rebirth begins to feel real. The collapse that once seemed like destruction now feels like a reset. And as he listens more closely, he senses that a larger revelation is approaching, one that will challenge him even more deeply and prepare him for the next stage of awakening waiting ahead. There is a moment after the collapse when everything feels strangely empty. No noise, no direction, no certainty, just a vast inner space that used to terrify him. But emptiness, when observed with honesty, carries a wisdom that fullness never could. It strips life down to its truth, to its raw essence. Pain may have cleared the room, but silence fills it with clarity. In this emptiness, awakening becomes possible because there is finally space for revelation. And slowly, without him noticing, this emptiness becomes the ground for transformation. He realizes that emptiness is not a void, it's a reset. It's like a blank page after years of scribbles, offering permission to start over. The shadow no longer overwhelms him here. It stands quietly in the corner, waiting to be understood rather than resisted. When the noise of old expectations fades, his truth has a chance to rise to the surface. Emptiness becomes a guide, whispering insights he couldn't hear before. And the more he listens, the more he feels the early stages of rebirth forming underneath his pain. Think of a person who loses a job, a relationship, or a long-held identity, and suddenly finds themselves standing in an emotional desert. At first, they panic. Emptiness feels dangerous, like standing on unfamiliar ground. But with time, they begin to notice what this silence makes visible: their creativity returning, their intuition sharpening, their essence speaking. In the absence of distractions, revelation blooms. Transformation doesn't start with action. It starts with awareness born in emptiness. And once they see this, emptiness becomes less frightening and more sacred. Emptiness has a way of dissolving illusions that pain exposed. It clears the clutter of old stories and outdated beliefs. In this spaciousness, he starts questioning everything he once assumed was truth. That questioning becomes awakening. He feels parts of himself reconnecting, small pieces of rebirth assembling like puzzle fragments. The shadow appears differently here, not as an enemy, but as a reminder of what he once abandoned. And with each passing day, the emptiness transforms into possibility instead of fear. Eventually, he sees that emptiness is not the end of the collapse. It's the doorway beyond it. It's the space where the heart recalibrates, where the mind breathes, where the soul remembers. Pain opened the door, but emptiness prepares him to walk through it. In this stillness, revelation gains shape and truth gains weight. And even though things seem quiet now, he feels something stirring in the distance, an inner movement pulling him gently toward the next phase of transformation, where an unexpected mirror is waiting to appear. When someone reaches rock bottom, they often believe they've hit the end of the road. But what they rarely notice at first is that rock bottom is not a wall. It's a mirror. In the aftermath of collapse, everything unnecessary falls away, leaving only truth staring back at them. The silence is almost unsettling, but it reveals their essence without filters. Pain becomes a lens, sharpening their awareness of patterns they've repeated for years. The shadow stands beside them, quietly reflecting everything they avoided, and in this raw reflection, the first signs of awakening begin to shimmer. He remembers a time when he felt absolutely drained, emotionally, financially, spiritually. That moment felt like complete defeat. But as he sat in the silence of his own collapse, he began noticing pieces of truth he had overlooked for years. He realized he had been living in a state of constant reaction rather than intention. Rock bottom showed him not who he wished he was, but who he truly was. It was a painful revelation, yet also a liberating one. And in that liberation, the groundwork for transformation quietly formed beneath him. Think of someone whose life falls apart so suddenly they feel stripped of identity, losing a job, a relationship, a home. The instinct is to see only the loss, but rock bottom shows them something else: their resilience, their forgotten desires, their hidden strength. It mirrors the truth of what they value and what they fear. In the shadow of this collapse, awakening becomes unavoidable. Pain, once overwhelming, starts revealing the beginning of rebirth. And through this reflection, they discover a version of themselves they had buried under years of survival mode. Rock bottom has no more illusions to offer. It forces honesty, the kind that reshapes someone from the inside out. In this stripped-down state, silence becomes an unexpected mentor. It points out the relationships that drained their essence, the habits that sabotaged their growth, the beliefs that kept them small. This clarity hurts, but pain is part of the transformation. Revelation appears like flashes of lightning, brief but bright enough to redirect their entire path, and these flashes gently push them toward something deeper waiting ahead. As he continues looking into this mirror, he begins to understand that rock bottom isn't a punishment, it's a restart. It reflects not just truth, but possibility. It shows what must be released for rebirth to occur. It reveals shadows he can finally integrate and strengths he can finally claim. And even though rock bottom feels like the lowest point, it often becomes the foundation for the most powerful transformation. Somewhere inside this reflection, he senses another shift coming, one that will pull him toward a profound internal recalibration, waiting in the next movement of his journey. Silence becomes a different force after someone has lived through a collapse. It no longer feels like emptiness or punishment. Now it acts as recalibration. In this quiet space, the soul reorganizes itself, almost like pieces of a puzzle finally finding their correct place. Pain softens into clarity, revealing truth in shapes the mind couldn't see when life was loud. The shadow settles, becoming less threatening and more instructive. Awakening deepens in this silence, guiding the person toward a subtle but powerful recalibration of their essence. And with every quiet breath, transformation quietly expands. He starts noticing how silence affects him differently now. Instead of triggering anxiety, it feels like alignment. It's the kind of stillness that rewires inner patterns, beliefs, reactions, priorities. In silence, truth becomes unmistakable. There's nowhere for illusions to hide. He begins making decisions from a place of depth rather than fear. The collapse that once disoriented him now feels like a necessary reset. And through this recalibration, he senses the early stages of rebirth taking hold inside him. Consider someone who has constantly filled their life with distractions. Work, noise, social validation, anything to avoid sitting alone with themselves. After a collapse, however, silence becomes unavoidable, and over time they realize this silence isn't there to torment them. It's there to reintroduce them to their essence. In that stillness, revelation appears in small but meaningful insights. Pain transforms into data, signals showing what needs healing, and through this quiet recalibration, awakening becomes a lived experience, not just an idea. Silence naturally rearranges internal priorities. What once felt urgent starts losing its power, and what once felt impossible now feels aligned. He becomes more aware of the choices that drain him versus the ones that nourish him. The shadow offers guidance rather than resistance. Truth rises without force. In this spiritual recalibration, transformation becomes something organic, unfolding gently, like the slow blooming of a flower. And each quiet moment prepares him for a deeper revelation approaching on the horizon. As silence continues its work, he discovers something profound. The soul doesn't grow louder, it grows clearer. Clarity is what recalibrates him, not volume. The collapse was the catalyst, but silence is the architect shaping his rebirth. Pain becomes a compass pointing toward truth. Revelation deepens layer by layer, and beneath it all, he feels the gentle pull into the next stage of his journey, one where courage will be required to step through the rubble and walk into the transformation waiting ahead. After the collapse, there is always a choice. Stay sitting in the rubble or stand up and walk through it. This is where courage enters the story. It's not the loud, heroic kind people post online. It's the quiet decision to take one step, even while still shaking. He looks around at the broken pieces of his old life and feels the weight of pain, but also the pull of awakening. The shadow no longer feels like a monster. It feels like a reminder of what he must finally face. Truth is scattered everywhere, like fragments on the ground, and transformation begins the moment he decides to move. He realizes that healing isn't just about understanding what happened, it's about walking through what remains. The conversations he avoided, the feelings he numbed, the boundaries he never set, all of them lie there in the rubble. Each step hurts, but every step is a small act of rebirth. Courage here means facing the mess without rushing to escape it. In the silence, he listens to what the rubble is trying to teach him. Revelation comes in small flashes. This no longer serves me. That belief was never mine. This fear has been running my life. and with each flash, he moves forward. Imagine someone leaving a long, unhealthy relationship. The day after, nothing feels clean or clear. There are memories, doubts, regrets scattered everywhere. To walk through that emotional rubble, they need courage to stop checking the other person's social media, courage to stop replaying every conversation, courage to build new routines. That courage doesn't erase the pain, but it transforms their relationship with it. Instead of being crushed by collapse, they slowly reclaim their essence. And step by step, they notice their awakening growing stronger than their fear. Walking through the rubble also means accepting that some pieces of the old life simply cannot be rebuilt. This acceptance is painful, but necessary. He sees parts of his identity lying there, old roles, old masks, old versions of truth. The shadow shows him where he clung to what was already gone. Courage now is choosing not to rebuild the same prison. In the silence, he starts intentionally choosing what to carry forward. This selection process is transformation, and with each choice, his rebirth becomes less of an idea and more of a reality. As he keeps moving, he realizes courage isn't about never looking back, it's about not walking backward. He can honor what once was without trying to resurrect it. The rubble becomes a sacred archive of lessons learned, not a place to live forever. Walking through it, he feels his essence strengthening, his truth solidifying, his awakening deepening. Pain is still present, but now it walks beside revelation, not against it. And somewhere beyond the ruins, he starts sensing the next stage of his journey calling him, a stage where the rebirth hidden in stillness will finally begin to take form. Stillness becomes a different kind of territory once someone has walked through their collapse. What once felt like emptiness now feels like fertile ground, quiet, deep, and strangely alive. In this stillness, rebirth takes its first breath. The shadow softens its edges, no longer demanding attention, but offering insight. Pain begins to dissolve into meaning, revealing the truth beneath every fracture. Awakening starts stitching together the parts of the self that were torn apart. And in this silence, transformation unfolds in ways he never expected. He starts noticing that stillness is not passive at all. It's active, but in a gentle, almost invisible way. It rearranges the inner world without force. Thoughts feel lighter, feelings make more sense. Even memories look different under this quiet light. In the absence of chaos, revelation becomes clearer. The collapse that once shattered him now serves as a foundation for his essence to rebuild itself. And slowly, he senses the unmistakable signs of rebirth rising from within, like a seed breaking open underground. Think of someone who spent years rushing from one obligation to another, convinced that slowing down meant falling behind. After their life collapses, the stillness that follows feels uncomfortable until it doesn't. In that stillness, they finally notice their intuition returning, their creativity waking up, their truth speaking again. They discover ideas they abandoned, passions they buried, parts of themselves they forgot. This is the quiet work of transformation, and though it happens slowly, it reshapes their identity more deeply than any dramatic change ever could. Stillness also reveals something profound. Rebirth isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or declarations. It arrives softly, through choices aligned with essence, boundaries rooted in truth, and habits that heal instead of harm. The shadow becomes a companion rather than a threat. Pain becomes a teacher rather than an enemy. Revelation becomes a daily visitor. And in this delicate balance, awakening becomes a way of living rather than a moment of insight. As he breathes inside this stillness, he feels a shift he can't fully describe, like stepping into a version of himself he had been circling for years. The collapse gave permission, the silence gave space, and now the rebirth gives direction. His essence feels clearer. His internal world feels lighter, And although his transformation is still unfolding, he knows he's standing at the threshold of something entirely new. What comes next will require presence, openness, and courage. Qualities the next movement in this journey will continue to shape. When everything collapses and silence becomes your only companion, you're not being punished, you're being rebuilt. Now that you understand what truly happens beneath the rubble, the question becomes, what are you going to do with this truth? The door to transformation has opened, but only you can choose to walk through it. Look at your life with honesty. Which parts of your identity no longer belong to you? Which beliefs have kept you small? And why continue carrying a burden that was never meant to define you? Every insight you felt in this video is a seed, but seeds only grow when planted with intention. Start today. One small decision, one honest conversation, one boundary, one moment of stillness. That's how rebirth begins. Quietly, consistently, powerfully. If this message touched you, challenged you, or helped you see yourself more clearly, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to Mind's Silent Echo and activate the notifications. This space exists to guide your awakening, your healing, and your evolution. Step by step, insight by insight, collapse by collapse. Your silence is not the end. It's the beginning of who you're becoming.